Hey peeps, today I'm talking all things piping. You can totally add piping to a French seam, which is great for a French seam lover like me. This is how I did it. I wanted to test the theory before I started doing the tutorial side of this video to see if it was possible to put piping in with a French seam and a bunch of gathers, and it's worked really well. Everything is caught and enclosed and the piping looks beautiful. So I'm going to show you the steps that I used to install the piping in this manner on the next tier of the skirt. We're going to be installing it between the second and third tier. I have found, and I would think, that the easiest way of putting piping on would be to the flat surface. So this is the ungathered edge of the bottom of the second tier, which will be put onto the gathered edge of the top of the third tier. So one of the reasons I like making my own piping, and I have probably mentioned this before, is that you can get your seam allowance to be the exact same seam allowance as the pattern that you're working with. So the first step I have for sewing the piping to a tier for a tiered and gathered skirt is you want to put the raw edge of your piping up against the raw edge of the tier or the fabric that you're going to be attaching it to. For this application, you want to sew with your zipper foot, which is what we use to make the piping. You want to sew over the previous line of stitching. So you're going to be sewing as close to the actual string, in my case, but whatever cording you've got inside your piping as possible. So over this line of stitching with the raw edge of the piping up against the raw edge of the fabric. And you want to make sure that your piping goes right to the very edge, which will be the side seam for this dress. You want to make sure you're starting your piping right up against that raw edge. I don't personally like to pin this. I find that it's a lengthy process that I don't find helps that much. It can put divots into the fabric and things when you pin something. You may wish to start off by pinning the piece into place, just so that when you are trying to position it under the presser foot, that the start is in the right place. I think you can see there's like a raised part where the pin goes through. You can use wonder clips for this as well. That would keep everything flatter. I just find that using nothing actually helps. So I'm going to sew this, and I've got all of the skirt in my lap, and I've also got my piping in my lap as well. I'm just going to feed the piping through from my lap. So I've unspooled a load, and when it starts to have any tension on it, then I'll unspool a bunch more. That way it's just something that I don't have to worry about or manage, and we'll feed the skirt up as we go. So I've got my zipper foot on, I've got the needle over as far as it will go to the left, and I'm going to aim to sew over the previous line of stitching that we used to secure the cording string, in my case, into place. And you do want to back stitch at the beginning. And I've got let's think, I've got 4.2 meters of fabric to attach this to, so this is going to take me a while. I'm going to take my time and make sure that the raw edge of the piping stays flush with the raw edge of my tiers of my skirt, and just readjust and go as slow as I need to make sure that everything is nice and accurate, because I've gone for something that's so contrasting to my main fabric. If anything goes slightly awry or off center, then it will be really noticeable. So let's get this sewn. So you should end up with something that looks like this, and then something that looks like that on the back. The reason that we've sewn it on as close to the cording edge as possible is to give us a nice guideline for one of the later steps. So the next thing to do is grab your next layer or next tier. This is 5 widths of the fabric sewn together, and I've already put in the gathering stitches for this one, and I've put them in at quarter points. So I've done gathering stitching up until the quarter of this, the half of this, the third quarter of this, so that I have a slightly easier time of distributing the gathers from this 5 panels to the 3 that are in the middle tier, so that none of the threads break, or if one of the threads break, it's not the end of the world, because it's the entirety of the length of this, which, let's see, so that's 5 meters, 120, 160. So there's 7 meters in this tier. Each panel of fabric is 140 wide and 5 in here. So yeah, if a gathering thread broke on 7 meters, I probably would cry. Not the end of the world, because I do 2 lines of gathering, and I have got a full tutorial on a tiered and gathered skirt, which is up here if you would like to have a look at that, and I will link it in the description down below. So I'm going to find the quarter points on the tier that we've just sewn the piping to. I'm going to mark those with a pin. I'm going to match up the corresponding quarter points from this tier, and then I'm going to pull the gathers taut and pin everything into place. It's going to be a very long and lengthy process, but I'm really loving how this is turning out so far, so I think it's going to be worth it. So find the quarter points, pin it all together, pull the gathers so that they're nice and even, and we're going to do that with the wrong sides together because we are French seaming this. Everything is pinned. That did take a while. I expected it to. So I have got the gathering side there and then the piped flat side here. I would usually sew with the gathered side up, and I am going to sew with the gathered side up, but I am going to use my zipper foot and I'm going to move the needle over to the right so that I'm sewing a 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge, because we're starting a French seam, so we want the first pass to be at a 1/4 of an inch. The reason I'm keeping my zipper foot on is because I will be able to run the edge of my zipper foot up against the edge of the piping and just control the line of stitching and hopefully get it very even the whole way along. And I like to sew with the gathering side up so that I can double check and make sure that everything is behaving itself and the gathers are forming as nicely as I possibly can get them to. So I'm going to go slowly. Again, this is going to take me a while because this is quite a long seam, but I'm going to go slowly and get this sewn into place, then I can trim off the excess. I have sewn the bottom tier to the middle tier. It's quite close to the edge of the piping, but there was a lot of floof from where I tore the fabric. I personally prefer to tear fabric for these kind of skirts because whilst you do get a lot of floof like this, and I allow for that in the width of the panels that I do, it does mean that you get a very even sized piece. So the next thing I'm going to do is trim really close to that line of stitching and trim away all of this bulk, because the next step in a French seam is to press it to one side so it's nice and flat, and then press it with the right sides together, which is exactly what we're going to do with this. The only change that we've made to the French seam process is to sew the piping on first. So I'm going to trim this, and I'm going to do it really carefully because I do not want to cut any of the bottom tier, but I am going to do it from this side up so I can get nice and close to that stitching that we've just done. Super fuzzy French seam spaghetti. So I need to press things. Well, I need to put this away, and now I need to press things. So hopefully you can see there I've trimmed really close to that line of stitching, and I am now going to take this all over to the ironing board. I'm going to press the seam allowance down, so the piping down into the gathered section, so the flat section is going to get pressed into the gathered section first and pressed flat so that this seam is nice and crisp and easy to work with. And then I'm going to go and press the right sides together, keeping that seam on this side. This is a little bit bulky. If I was using any thicker fabric than this, I would have bias bound these raw edges rather than tried a French seam, because obviously we've got 2 layers of fabric, one of which is being gathered, so more bulk being added, and then we've got the 2 layers of the piping being put in there as well. So this is the heaviest weight of fabric that I would try this with, but as I showed you earlier, I tried it and it did work, and I like how it looked. So French seams it is. If you are using a heavier weight fabric, although given how densely gathered this skirt is, that might, I mean, it could be very pretty. It would be a very floofy, poofy skirt if it was a denser weight of fabric than this chambray that I'm using, which is a linen viscose blend from Lady McElroy, in case you hadn't noticed the Cobra corsageness of it. Because it's such a lightweight fabric, I'm getting away with it, but anything heavier than this, I would highly recommend that you sew these as normal seams and bias bind the edge, which I'm going to show you with the hem, or a similar technique with the hem. Anyway, pressing first. I have pressed the seam flat and then I've pressed it over, and I'm now going to go along and top stitch, or I mean, it's not top stitching, it is actual stitching, construction stitch. I'm going to run my line of stitching as close to, if not even slightly further in from this pink line of stitching, which is what secured the piping to the bottom of the second tier. And I'm going to do that with the zipper foot again. I want to be as close, if not a little bit further over, just to make sure that the piping is nice and snug within the seam. You don't want to sew too far in, because if you do, you'll end end up with the flange of the piping showing, this part of the piping showing, not just the actual round cord stuffed part of the piping, which is the look you want to achieve. Again, I'm not going to pin this because I find that it's just easier for my way of sewing and my preference not to pin, but you can totally pin this into place if you want. You also just want to, as you're going, again this is going to take a while because it's quite a long seam, but as you're going just make sure that you're not catching anything that you don't want to be catching and that everything's lying nice and flatly. The feed dog should help with the gathering part so you won't end up with any unsightly puckers, and we've still got our gathering stitching in from earlier, we haven't removed that yet, so again that will help corral the gathers in hopefully a pretty way. So I'm going to get that entire seam sewn and then we combine the side seams, which there are a few tricks for. This one first though. It is complete. Well, the actual piping of the tiers is complete. I really like how it looks. Like I said, I think it's quite subtle, but I think the overall impression when the dress is together is going to be really, really pretty. The last thing that I need to do is to press this seam, and I'm going to press the seam allowance up to the tier above it because that's how it's wanting to lie naturally. So the piping is going to be laying across the top of the gathers. Then we can work on the side seams, finishing those off so that they're nice and cleanly finished for the inside of the dress. Piping a French seam is going to end up with a bulkier seam, so something you do want to consider is the fabric that you're using. I have a linen chambray. This is the Chloe chambray from Lady McElroy. This and possibly a cotton lawn would be the heaviest weight of fabric that I would try and do a gathered French seam including piping in. I have ended up with quite chunky seams in the skirt, but that's worked quite well for adding some extra volume and making the skirt look really poofy, so it's something that I do really, really like. But it will end up with a bulkier French seam because of all the layers of fabric that you are enclosing in that seam, so it is something to bear in mind, and I wouldn't try it with too thick a fabric. I have one large video of all of the mini tutorials back to back, so hopefully I have covered what you're looking for in that. I will link to the playlist and all of the individual videos in the description down below. But if you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section down below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. If you've enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one here.